Welcome, welcome. Welcome to, welcome to today's service. We are going to get started here. Well, we are getting started. Just give me a second to get to the stage. All right. Let's pull this up. I like to check the audio. Make sure you guys can hear it all. All right, sounds good. Let's just jump in today. So you can turn to Genesis. Probably figured that out. This is our last day to be studying the book of or studying Genesis for a little while, because tonight we'll have our last. Let me turn the audio off on that. We're gonna have our a service tonight, and then tomorrow morning we'll kick off Revelation. So that's going to be a lot of fun. I can see by the framing, I didn't change this from the message last night. So, sorry, it's not as zoomed in as it's supposed to be. So we're going to be covering the Tower of Babel. So you can turn to Genesis chapter 11. We're going to read that in just a second, part of that. And kind of get into and dive into the story of the Tower of Babel tonight, or this morning, or this afternoon. It's 2:30. And so that's what we're going to be doing today, and kind of discussing that a little bit. Going over some interesting things, some things that you typically don't learn in Sunday school about the Tower of Babel. That's why it's so interesting to really dive in and really study your Bible, because there's things that, when they're making these as little stories to teach in kids' church or Sunday school, there's only so much detail you can go in. You can't take a small child and be like, and go, things like the two calendars and reconciling the calendars that we went over yesterday. There's only so much of that you can do in kids' church, in a small class. And then, by the time you're in a regular service, we grew up in a time where now there's a lot more teaching than there used to be, but there's a lot of, preaching. A lot of these things, these stories we're taking for granted. We don't typically dive into a lot of the details. So it's really interesting when we get and we really begin and develop the habit of studying the Bible for ourselves. We really learn a lot of really cool stuff. And I'm just going to throw out there, I'm not going to, this is a half announcement. Monday night, so I talked about how the evening service is Mondays, Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays. Are going to kind of turn in, we're going to call them revival nights. Wednesday, there's not a night service because there's youth, so there's youth that night. So we have a 6 a.m. and I think it's 12 p.m. service. So there's not a night service that night. And then Saturdays are going to be a little more of a kind of next-gen / prayer worship service. There will be speaking. I will be speaking tonight, but it's going to be a heavy emphasis on prayer, and yeah, basically that. So with that, this Monday, I know we're saying revival nights, but this Monday we're going to do something a little different. So I'm not going to announce yet. I'm going to wait till Sunday. But if you're watching these, you get a little bit of a preview to know that Monday's night service will be a little bit different, even from the regular revival nights. And you should clear your calendars. You're going to want to be here. If you're at all interested in any of this stuff that we've been doing and the studying and diving in, you're going to want to be here Monday night, 6 p.m. It's going to be really good. Okay, let's jump in. Let's read. So chapter 11, verse 1, the Tower of Babel. At one time, all the people of the world spoke the same language and used the same words. Makes sense. They all came off the boat together. As the people migrated to the east, they found a plain in the land of Babylonia and settled there. They began saying to each other, "Let's make bricks and harden them with fire." In this region, bricks were used instead of stone, and tar was used for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let's build a great city for ourselves with a tower that reaches into the sky. This will make us famous and keep us from being scattered all over the world." But the Lord came down and looked at the city and the tower the people were building. "Look," he said, "the people are united, and they shall speak, and they all speak the same language. After this, nothing they set out to do will be impossible for them. Come, let's go down and confuse the people with different languages. Then they won't be able to understand each other." In that way, the Lord scattered them all over the world, and they stopped building the city. That is why the city was called Babel, because that is where the Lord confused the people with different languages. In this way, he scattered them all over the world. And we're going to stop there. All right, we're just going to go through this, and we're going to just kind of go through a couple things here. So the first off we can see is they begin building this big city. Now, again, I'm going to make a lot of references today at Sunday school. You grew up with this, and it's just like a big tower they're building, right? You see like the flannel graph, you see the coloring book pages, and it's like they're just building this tower. And the way I kind of picked it up, I'm not saying my teachers necessarily taught it this way, but the way I kind of picked it up was this idea that they were trying to build a tower to kind of protect themselves from ever really just being in God's mercy again. Like, if God ever decides to do a flood or do some sort of judgment, we have this tower that is a refuge that we can protect ourselves even from God, even with the idea of ascending to heaven and just kind of forcing our way into heaven, right? That's kind of how I picked up as a kid. But that's not really the case. I mean, it talks about a city. It's not just a giant tower. Like, they're building a city. In fact, it says in there at one point, let's see where it says, come build a great city for ourselves with a tower that reaches into the sky. This will make us famous and keep us from being scattered over the world. Well, here's the problem with that. What was the command from God after they got out of the ark? It was to scatter. God told them to scatter, and now we have here man rebelling against God's command, saying, hey, let's build this giant city to keep everyone from scattering. Let's keep everyone here locally centralized. And we'll become so famous that anyone who hears about us will travel and want to live here. So it's literally rebellion against God from the very beginning. God gives the directive to scatter, to go out through all the different parts of the world and really do what essentially did happen, is have the different nations. You know, we have America, we have Asia, we have everything, you know, England, Germany, all the things, and I know those over the years have changed. And so we see this idea of it's less about like, let's make a safety from God, let's figure out a way to get to heaven and, you know, I don't know, throw God off the throne, whatever my young mind was thinking. And it's much more about this idea of, well, hey, we don't want everyone scattering out again. We want to keep everyone here. Why exactly? I'm not sure, but what I am sure of is it was the exact opposite of what the Lord told them to do. So this tower, it's seriously taught. Okay, I kind of talked about that a little bit. Sometimes we get a little bit of a Sunday school coloring page idea in our head. I want to talk for a second about the ascent of man versus the descent of man. So, okay. You're pretty much always told, you know, growing up, this idea of that things are just getting better and better. We're progressing as civilization. And we kind of really rely on the progression of technology to think about this. So we think of how technology progresses, how, you know, in the 1900s, the Industrial Revolution took off and how things kind of just exploded. I remember back, I want to say 2006. Somewhere around 2006, 2007, I was working for the County Office of Education at Merced. And a lot of my job was to go to different schools and school events, and I did videography for them. So I recorded things, I produced videos for them, I captured the event so it could be seen later, all this kind of stuff. And I remember at one event, it was actually I believe it was at my alma mater. I was at Atwater High, and we're in the gymnasium, and we're doing some sort of job fair type thing. That was a lot of it, ROP, the idea of, so I worked under CAE, Careers and Alternative Education, and then ROP was one other thing, Regional Occupation Program. It helped kids get jobs, basically, and learn job skills. And so we did a lot of like job fairs and stuff like that. And so this lady, we were talking, and I don't know if I think it must have been after the job fair was kind of over. Is she made the comment, and I know it was right after, like, not right, but like a little bit after the first iPhone came out. I want to say 06, could have been 07, or did the iPhone not come out till 08? No, it must have been 06, 07. So it was either, I can't remember the exact details, but it was either right after or right before the iPhone came out. And she made the comment, like, I think technology has peaked. Like, I think this is it. And I said, really? Because I was a bit of a technologist at the time. I said, really? Like, what makes you think that? That seemed like the weirdest thing to say to me. And luckily, I was tactful enough. This lady was 2-3 times my age. So I didn't try to argue. Oh, that's so dumb. Why in the world would you say that? Look, there's so much more to go. Look, like, I was like, oh, really? Like, what makes you think that? And I remember she pulled out her cell phone. And again, this is where I can't remember if it was either right before or right after. So it was either right after the iPhone. So she either pulled out an iPhone and was like, look, like, we have the iPhone. Like, how much better could you get? And this would have been the iPhone 1. So this is, quite humorous for those who, had the iPhone 1. It was either that or she showed it was right before that. And then right after she said this, like, the first iPhone came out, just even more disproving what she said. But either way, she had her cell phone and she's like, look at how amazing this is. Like, I can make calls. I can send texts. I wish she had said she could send picture text, because then I would know it was before the iPhone. I know she did have the iPhone. Okay, that's a bit of a joke for anyone who had the early models of iPhone. I remember I had a friend. I was very Android back then, and I had a friend who was like, name one thing the Android can do the iPhone can't. Text pictures? He was like, okay, something else. NFC? Like, he's like, well, something else. And I did that like 3 times. I was like, dude, we could do this all day. No, you're right. If you eliminate everything that the Android can do that the iPhone can, eventually you're right. Like, if you don't count those, and there's nothing that can, like, this is insane after like 3 rounds. So she's like, the phone, like, these cell phones, they're amazing. Like, I can't imagine technology getting any better. Now, you can argue that in one sense she was right. Like, cell phones really have not progressed that much since, like, a couple years in. So I remember I was bored with myself. I'm getting way off track on this, but a little story time. I remember switching over. This is how I got over to iPhone. I went to iPhone 6 because I was like, all the phones, like, nothing ever changes. Nothing ever upgrades. Every new phone, it's a little bit faster. The battery holds a little bit more juice. The processor's a little bit better, which, is part of what makes it faster. And the camera's a tiny bit better. I'm like, this is boring. So I remember going over to iPhone, and I said, I'll go back to Android when there's like a quantum leap in, like, technology, thinking I'd have the iPhone, like, 6. And then instead of going to the 7, I'd go back to Android. It still hasn't happened. Like, there's still, iPhones aren't much better. Just, they haven't, they're kind of boring. They're just a little bit faster, a little bit better, a little bit better cameras. But the way things have progressed, right? And so we look at this idea that things are constantly getting better. Man is evolving. Man is ascending, right? And the thing is, this idea was tied to evolution, that we, as a species, we evolved into man, and we're continuing to evolve and get better every generation. Well, we've, for the most part, disproved evolution. I'm sure a few people still believe in it, but I think, all in all, I think most people realize that evolution is incredibly problematic. I think maybe public education is about the only place still seriously teaching this. But we've pretty much gotten away from that idea. But the problem is we've held on to this man ascending, this ascension of man, that we're constantly getting better. And yes, it seems deceptive because it does look like things are getting better because we see technology's getting better, blah, 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 blah. But I would argue, well, I don't have to argue because it's in the Bible, but this idea of it's actually the opposite, that it's the dissension of man. And there's a point to this. I will tie this back into Tower of Babel. I'm just feeling a little chatty today. So this idea that we are actually descending, not devolving, but it's the descent of man, that man is getting to be less and less, like over time. Okay, well, for one, you say, well, yeah, but what about your argument about technology? Well, really, if you look at it, how many times in your life have you heard someone make a comment about, like, oh yeah, the new cars, they're faster, they have more fuel efficiency, blah, 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 blah. But if I was going to be in an accident, I'd rather take one of the old metal boats from back in the day, right? There's certain things like, maybe they've gotten more efficient in areas, but in some ways it's like, have we really progressed? Like, homes aren't as good as they used to be, right? Like, a lot of the stuff. But, okay, outside of technology, man in general, if you look back, you can see, like, how many times have you seen memes or ideas on the internet about how, like, young men today versus young men then, and they'd show like a man from like World War II or something like that, and then he's like manly and he's like serving his country, he's like saving the world from Nazis, and then it's like young men today, and it's like a hippie, vegan, millennial, like whatever, all the crunchy stuff, right? And it's like, oh, they used the wrong kind of soy milk, like my day's ruined, right? And they show the comparison. And I know that's just a small sample size, but all in all, there's a lot of things to really show it. For one thing, look at the epidemic of testosterone in men. I remember the first time I heard about this was, it must have been 15, 20 years ago, and I was somewhere, I think it was a Christian event, a service or something, and they talked about how testosterone in men is going down, and there's lots of reasons for that, and some of it is our environment and the plastics and stuff like that. And they said that, and I remember they were talking to like us, our age, so I would have been, earlier, mid-20s. I remember them saying, your sons will have, and I want to say it was 1/4 the amount of testosterone as your grandfather. And I was like, wow, and I didn't really understand the importance of testosterone at the time. I just understood like, well, yeah, testosterone makes a boy, estrogen makes a girl. I know that's not really true. We both have both and whatnot. But at the time, I'm like, yeah, it's like the manly hormone. And I was like, that's probably not good. It was like, that's really weird. And so this idea that like we are really, if you think about it, over the years, like we are as the human species kind of on a descent, not an ascent. I mean, if you compare the average person today, their knowledge of the world, like you see the videos where people go out and they interview people and no one knows anything. Like, what's the capital of California? What is the capital of America? Who did we fight in World War II? They'll ask a basic trivia, and like no one knows anything. You could argue, well, we don't have to. We have phones. We can just look it up. So this idea that like we feel like we're so superior, and everyone in the past is inferior. So this idea of like the Tower of Babel, like, well, how could they have built this tower, right? In fact, there's even conspiracy theories because you look at the modern day architecture and you compare it to what it used to be, and there's the totalitarian conspiracy about how like, whoa, look, like our buildings don't look like these old buildings. It's because another civilization built these buildings, right? There's all these conspiracy theories and stuff around it. My daughter did a report on it one year for school, so it's kind of interesting. But it's clear that like things aren't made the way they used to be. Men aren't built the way they used to be. Women aren't built the way they used to be. There's obviously exceptions to this. I'm just saying by far in general, like society has kind of devolved in that sense. And so this idea of this entropy rather than this ascension, and really there were two main places this really happened. Obviously the fall was the largest amount of entropy at this point. Like we have no clue what the pre-fall world was like. We have no clue because we weren't around. Even the flood. The flood was another time where, because of the geological changes of the world, the things that happened, whether you believe in, I'm not a big fan of, the dome of water above the earth. There's, whether you believe that or not, that's one contributing factor. That's not my favorite theory because I feel like there's some math issues there, but that's a very popular one. The idea, they say the barometric pressure would have been before the flood at least double. He said in order for like pterodactyls or those kind of creatures, whether they're literally pterodactyls back then or not, I don't know, but they had clearly some sort of those kind of giant flying creatures. They wouldn't be able to fly today. There's not enough barometric pressure for them to even be able to fly, and so that back before the flood there would have had to been at least twice the amount of that pressure. There's a lot of different things between the air. We can see that like, in the past it seems like the earth was made of sterner stuff in that sense, almost as if it's all winding down, like the book of Revelation talks about, and other books in the New Testament as well. So this idea of like, well, yeah, but weren't they basically just one level away from Neanderthals? Like, how could they have built the tower? How could they have built? No, like this actually, you got to think of it from a logical perspective. They were probably much more advanced and sophisticated than we think. In fact, the account of Genesis, we talked about this a few months ago. They had metalwork way earlier than scientists once supposed. It talks about right in the beginning of the metalwork and the different, descendants of Cain and the farming, the husbandry, being, a worker of land, the metalwork, the things they did really early on. So, yeah, this idea of we kind of get some of this from these evolutionary teachings of like, the earth is millions of years old. Like, we don't believe that, but we kind of believe that. We buy into things like, like the Neanderthals, we're this way because we, millions of years of genetic evolution. This is why we're this way. We hear these things all the time as Christians, and we don't really stop and think about them. But this idea that we get a lot of these ideas from some of this stuff. So, okay, I want to move on. But that's just basically the idea that the descent of man rather than the ascent. The ascent of man is constantly getting better, actually has broken off from evolution and has stuck around. This tower that was in this city, this Tower of Babel in this city, had both pagan and astrological designs. So this is really interesting. If you're anything like me, you were raised to absolutely avoid like the zodiac and I can think it was fortune telling, horoscopes and all those things, because they were bad. We shouldn't look to the stars. We should look to the one who made the stars, the creator of the stars. But what's interesting is that whole thing is actually a perversion. It's not that stuff is necessarily completely bad, but it was perverted and twisted to become a pagan version of it. So this is something that's really interesting is the original version of this stuff would have actually been much closer to the source. If you look at the stars, starting from the brightest constellation of stars and work your way down to the dimmest, it actually tells the story of God's plan. It starts off with the brightest constellation, essentially telling the story of a virgin mother, and it goes all the way down to God's story. And so it's actually very likely that Adam and Enoch and a lot of these early fathers would have used the stars and the constellations to point to God's redemptive work throughout history. Like, this is what God is doing. They had that prophecy from after the fall of the woman and the seed, and they could see it in the stars. It would teach. I'm not saying literally that happened, but it's very likely that was the case, and this was passed down, and they were taught because the entire story of redemption is in the constellation of the stars. And then we get to the Tower of Babel, and it was perverted, it was changed, it was turned into mythology. So these constellations that once pointed to God's redemptive story and his plan became what it is today, mythology. And it's interesting. I want to read this so I say it right. Converted mythology and pagan beliefs. Most astrologers use the zodiac from this period, this Babylonian period that would have been changed at the Tower of Babel. These pictures and labels, and I don't know a lot about this stuff because, again, I really avoided it, so I'm assuming if you understand this stuff, the idea of pictures and labels would make sense. I know there's constellations. You've got stuff like, let me try to think. I'm totally blanking now. But I remember even hearing things like growing up in like junior high, and a girl would be like, "Oh, what's your zodiac, whatever," to some guy, and he'd say, we're not, like Scorpio, whatever they are. Like, "Oh yeah, we're not compatible." I'm like, okay, that's interesting. But so these symbols and pictures and labels are virtually the same in all languages. They all came from the Babel/Babylonian origin right here in the Tower of Babel. Of course, it's a pagan version that we are exposed to nowadays. So the whole idea of the zodiac, and you're like, well, what's the big deal? The horoscopes and the zodiac is a pagan perversion of the actual truth. So if you're interested in that stuff, go study the pre-Babel version. Go look this stuff up and really learn it, and you can see the story of God's redemptive purpose in the stars. Don't spend your time learning and studying the pagan one. It's amazing to me how many Christians will allow so many of these different like pagan things in their life and then wonder why their lives aren't really the way it should be. I read the Bible and my life's not like that it says it should be. It was like, well, yeah, but you look to, astrology, you look to the horoscope, you look to all these things, and you do all these other things that the Bible would say the opposite of, and then you wonder why you're not getting the results, why your life is not the way you think it should be. So we got to keep turning back to the Bible. And then, okay, so we talked in the beginning about, I kind of jumped ahead. We talked in the beginning about how God had commanded them to scatter. Instead, they gathered. And so that end where it says that God came down and saw what they were doing, he basically saw their rebellion, that they were doing the exact opposite. Like, could you imagine what this must be like to be God? This is not too far, I mean, especially from God's perspective, from the flood. And it's like, look, they're already doing it again. There's no limit to what man can do. It's a reference to the evil intentions of man, what man is willing to do. This doesn't mean that, oh, yeah, if they decided to build mech warriors, they could have built mech warriors, right? Like, I remember being a kid thinking, oh, they were trying to build a tower to heaven, and the Bible says that there was no limit to what they could do, that they literally would have done it. Maybe they got to a certain point, and the oxygen was too thin. People started passing out. They would have figured this all out. Eventually, maybe they got up to a certain point into space, and they're like, well, God's not here. Oh, maybe heaven's more like another dimension, and they figured that out. And right? I just assumed that's what it meant, but it was a reference to God was saying there's no limit to the evil that men will do. And so he goes, okay, they're not listening, they're not scattering. Well, let's make them scatter. And he changes the languages, which is the whole idea of the Tower of Babel. It becomes almost like a pun because of the language changing in Babel, right? They couldn't understand each other. And that causes them to scatter. I actually have my personal opinion. I can't necessarily support this with the Bible. I think that there was possibly some prejudice and stuff in there as well, because you're all working on a city, you all of a sudden speak different languages. Yeah, you could all just give up and scatter, but that seems like, how hard would it be? Like, how long would it have taken these people who were very intelligent? Remember Adam, not too far removed, could name all the animals. Like, clearly these people had much more intellectual capacity than we do. Again, this is back to their sophistication. These people were living, we'll just round up and say about 1,000 years. The amount of time they had to learn and gather knowledge and experience, clearly, intellectually, like, we're their inferiors. How long would it have taken them to figure out the languages? I don't think it was just the language. I personally think there was some sort of prejudice that was introduced as well, where these different groups scattered and stayed with their own kinds. There was some sort of enmity put between the different groups. Again, can't necessarily support that with the Bible, but that is my own personal opinion. I've watched throughout my life how little tiny differences cause people to hate each other. Black versus white, or even, in the black community of different, you're lighter than us, so, you're ostracized. Every little thing is going to turn into some way of how we can hate each other. So this idea of all of a sudden everyone has different languages, to me it makes sense that part of the scattering wasn't like, oh no, we can't understand each other, and there's no way we could ever figure out how to interpret between languages. To me, I think that there was a instant distrust, dislike, even hatred between them, and they all just kind of scattered. I think it's pretty amazing that man's ability to add in kind of hatred and bigotry and all these things, pretty much no matter what. Okay, remember, God told them to scatter, and they wouldn't, so he did it for them by confusing the languages. Okay, that is all I've got for today. Leave a comment. Ask your questions. If you have questions, we can do some follow-up on this stuff later on. But yeah, that's it for today. So with that, I'm going to close us in prayer. Excuse me as I walk up the stage as I do this. But Lord, I just thank you for today. I thank you for the ability to study your word and to learn and gain wisdom from your word. I just thank you for that, Lord. I just pray that for tomorrow's service, you be with each and every one, and that we'll all be able to gather tomorrow for the beginning of our Revelation